We were hoping that we could have 100,000 people. We ended up with about a minimum of 250,000, maybe more. And it sent a message around the world, especially Martin's speech, "I Have a Dream," that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will sit down at a table with a brotherhood. And it wasn't hostile, it was prayerful. And I think we won the support of the nation for civil rights on that occasion. The evening after the march, the leaders of the 6 civil rights organizations went to the White House and had a meeting with President Kennedy. And it was at that meeting, he had watched the march on television. He had heard Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. He was very impressed and moved by it. See, everybody was afraid that this would be a riot, like January 6th, but I don't think there was a single arrest. And people came and they were very polite, they were very courteous. We sang freedom songs, we listened to speeches, but I don't think there was a single incident that occurred anywhere in Washington that day, because people from Washington participated also. Well, we made a lot of progress since 1963, but we have also had setbacks. We still don't have the proportion that represents our population in many places. But freedom is a constant struggle. If there is a place where we can learn to live together as brothers and sisters rather than perish together as fools, it's the United States of America.
That was Andrew Young, the former mayor of Atlanta and a very integral part of the civil rights movement. Welcome back, folks, to My Country with Scott Cannon here on Issues and Answers Friday. Give me a call, 219-885-1371. That number again, 219-885-1371. If you were at the March on Washington, watched the March on Washington, have studied the March on Washington, whatever, you might be able to inform me on some things about it, or just tell me how you felt about that day and whether we've made the progress that we should have made over the last 60 years. Don't hesitate to call in, 219-885-1371, 219-885-1371. I'd like to hear what you would think about this, because this is actually one of the most important events in American history. It really is. You can't really overstate the importance of the March on Washington. That's why I felt so obligated to give it such a big part of this show. Hopefully I'll be able to fill the rest of the show with it. But this is a monumental event. Or should I say it was a monumental event held in Washington, D.C. on August the 28th, 1963. The purpose of the march was to advocate for the civil and economic rights of African Americans. Now, notice they didn't say anything about the feminists. They didn't say nothing about the lugga booga tugga kamugga. They didn't say anything about illegal immigrants. Okay? The purpose of the march was to advocate for the civil and economic rights of African Americans. And that is important because I feel like over the last 50 years, black leaders particularly have allowed others to colonize the civil rights movement and usurp the civil rights movement and bastardize and water down the civil rights movement and use it for their own purposes that ultimately don't benefit the very people who all that was being done for. This march was organized by A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. A. Philip Randolph, the former vice president of the AFL-CIO, maybe the greatest black labor leader, not definitely the greatest black labor leader in the history of this country. Randolph and Rustin, they built an alliance of civil rights, labor, and religious organizations that came together under the banner of jobs and freedom. Now you see, it doesn't say anything about tolerance and, tolerance and feelings or something. No, jobs and freedom, because they understood that racism fundamentally was class warfare against the black community. That the black community needed jobs and freedom. We needed economic liberation. It wasn't about somebody hurting our feelings because we're being black. Oh my God, I feel so bad because I'm black and they hurting my feelings by not liking me. No, it was about jobs and freedom, economic and civil rights. Estimates of the number of participants varied from 200,000 to 300,000, but most widely cited estimate is about 250,000 people. Observers estimated that about 75% to 80% of the marchers were African Americans. On August 28th, 1963, more than 2,000 buses, 21 chartered trains, 100 chartered airlines, and uncounted amounts of cars converged on Washington, D.C. All regularly scheduled planes, trains, and buses were also filled to capacity. Wow. This march is one of the largest political rallies for human rights in the history of America. The most high-profile white organizer of this march was Walter Reuther, who was the president of United Auto Workers. And I always love to talk about, that's every show, if you listen to the show, I end every single show with God bless the working class, God bless organized labor. That is a big part of the reason why. The Civil Rights Coalition was not just angry black people or disenfranchised black people. It was also organized labor. It was also labor unions. It was also the clergy, Catholic priests. We talked about the rabbi some months ago during the Kyrie Irving debacle that Martin Luther King considered his rabbi. Abraham, I forgot what the man's, I want to say Abraham Herschel. Rabbi Abraham Herschel, I think was his name, that Martin Luther King considered his rabbi. But it was these groups, labor unions and religious groups, who got together and were the driving forces of this, not only this march, but much of the civil rights activism that was going on, a lot of the progress that was made. At the march, obviously, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech was the closing, sort of the crescendo, as we say in music, of such an important event. And it went on to become one of the most important, not only speeches, but one of the most important events in the history of at least modern world history. This march is credited with helping to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It preceded the Selma voting rights movement when the national media coverage contributed to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that year. So it's important to understand how important this march was to getting the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And not only that, the Fair Housing Act, and really putting gas in the ship of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. I think a lot of people don't understand that those policies changed millions of lives. They really did. I really don't think people understand a lot of times the magnitude of the progress that not only black people made, but the working class and the poor in America in general made in just a few decades, the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s here in the United States, some of the greatest movements that we've ever had in this country's history, in modern world history. I always say 500 years from now, people will look back at the mid to late 20th century in the United States as one of the great periods in the history of the world. I truly believe that, and I'm sure a lot of you lived through it. A lot of you people were a part of it. A lot of you who are part of civil rights organizations, who are part of labor unions, who are part of the clergy at that time, you guys contributed to something that my generation probably will never experience, unfortunately, because, you know, being born a little bit too late. But the amount of progress that you guys contributed to in such a short period of time is really incredible. It really is. It's awe-inspiring, the amount of things that even here in Northwest Indiana, a lot of people like Richard Gordon Hatcher, who you know, was the first black man elected mayor of a major city in the country. You know, things like that were huge, monumental. The 1972 National Black Political Convention held right here in Gary, Indiana. So much progress was made in such a short period of time here in this country. I guess that's why the right had to go out of its way to put an end to that in the 1970s. But what was the world like that inspired the March on Washington to happen? What was the background? What was the previous 100 years after the end of slavery like that inspired the March on Washington? Why was it needed? Well, African Americans were technically freed from slavery under the 13th Amendment. Technically, we were granted citizenship by the 14th Amendment. And technically, African Americans were supposed to be citizens and granted voting rights, full voting rights, by the 15th Amendment in the years soon after the Civil War. But the Democratic Party at that point, which was full of conservatives, regained power after the end of the Reconstruction era in 1877 and imposed many restrictions on people of color in the South. I've talked about this many times here on this show. It is important to talk about Reconstruction and the opportunities that were lost by the black community post-1877. There were over 2,000 black politicians in this country alone, just in the southern United States in the 1870s. This was a decade after slavery ended, and those politicians were lynched. Black people's voting rights were taken away. Black communities were burned to the ground. And so we went from having thousands of black politicians to zero political representation almost for the next 100 years. At the turn of the century, southern states passed constitutions and laws that disenfranchised most black people and many poor whites, excluding them from the political system. White people imposed social, economic, and political repression against black people into the 1960s under a system of legal, completely legal, discrimination known as Jim Crow. These laws were pervasive throughout the South, and black people suffered discrimination in private businesses as well, as most were prevented from voting, often through violent means. It wasn't just, hey, brother, you can't vote here. It was, you know, a gun pointed at you saying you better not try to vote here. That's how you go from 2,000 black politicians to zero black politicians in less than a decade. During the 20th century, civil rights organizers began to develop ideas for a march on Washington, D.C. to seek justice. Earlier efforts to organized a demonstration included the March on Washington movement in the 1940s. A. Philip Randolph, once again, we just talked about this brother, the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, president of the Negro American Labor Council, and the vice president of the American Federation of Labor, CIO, was a key instigator in 1941. You see, with Bayard Rustin, Randolph called for 100,000 black workers to march on Washington, D.C. in protest of discriminatory hiring during World War II by U.S. military contractors and demanding an executive order to correct that. Faced with a mass march scheduled for July 1st, 1941, Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802 on June 25th. The order established the Committee on Fair Employment Practice and banned discriminatory hiring in the defense industry, leading to improvement for many defense workers. Randolph, at that point, called off the march. And I talk about that very often, about how A. Philip Randolph basically told Franklin Roosevelt, hey, look, if you don't integrate the war industry, like the munitions industry, etc., and let black people be able to get in on this, then we are going to march on you. And at that point, thousands and thousands of black people benefited. This is why a lot of our families who came from the South are here now, because we were able to benefit from a lot of these, the jobs that came from things like that. Let me get this call real quick. Hello, caller.
Hey, Scott.
What's up?
Now, while you're talking about that voters, let me tell you what they did to the blacks in Mississippi.
Oh, yes.
Now, this what they forget about all that fighting, but let me tell you what them low-down dogs did. Let's talk about from here to Low, Indiana.
Yeah.
Now, just listen now. They know the blacks didn't have no cars. So the distance they will make black walk is from Low, Indiana, all the way to North Chicago, cause that's some country miles. So a lot of blacks, they thought the blacks weren't going to be able to do it, but a lot of blacks, they got up at 12 o'clock at night and started that long, long journey.
Wow.
Now, all I can say is, when you talk to the family in Jackson, somebody down there old enough to remember all of this.
Yeah.
They made them walk the long way. But we made it. We made it.
We did.
But I'm talking about the blacks. We made it.
Yes.
To that long journey. Somebody else besides me in Jackson will tell you that whole story.
Well, all right. Well, thank you for your call. Thank you for letting me know. Keep listening.
Okay.
Exactly. Keep listening. Wow, that is incredible. That is incredible. Making black people walk that much of a distance just to vote. Just to vote. That's one of the reasons I always vote. You know, you guys know I don't hide my voting preferences from anybody. Even if my candidate doesn't win, I make sure my name is on those voter rolls. I make sure that my name is on those voter rolls. I told you guys last year when I tried to vote in the primaries, there was actually some weird irregularity. They couldn't find my license. I went to the Genesis Center to vote early, and my license, like they couldn't read my license or something. And I had to come here because I was running the boards here, but I couldn't get out of the voting place. So I said, okay, look, I'll come back later on and we'll try this again. Thank God I had voted early. Thank God I had gone to the early voting right there at the Genesis Center. When I came back an hour later, they were able to finally find me on the voter rolls and I could vote. Now imagine had I waited to election day when there were long lines around my polling place because they've started taking away voting places here in the city of Gary. For what reason, I don't know. They want to make it harder for us to be represented. Ironically, 60 years after all this has gone down. But if I had waited to election day to vote, and they couldn't find me on the voter rolls, we couldn't have done it. I wouldn't have been able to vote. I would have just had to go home because there would have been dozens, maybe hundreds of people in line trying to vote as well, and they can't just stop the line for me. So that's why I stress the importance of early voting. Even if you, like I said, if you don't like the people who are voting, you know, you can always vote third party for the purpose of making sure that the third party gets 5% and therefore is eligible for matching funds. But it is important to remember that people used to walk that far. You heard what the caller said. Walk that far just to get the vote. That is incredible. That is incredible. It really is. A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin continued to organize around the idea of a mass march on Washington. They envisioned several large marches during the 1940s, but all were called off despite criticism from Bayard Rustin. Their prayer pilgrimage for freedom held at the Lincoln Memorial on May 17, 1957, key leaders included Adam Clayton Powell, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Roy Wilkins, and Mahalia Jackson. The 1963 march was part of the rapidly expanding civil rights movement, which included demonstrations and nonviolent direct action across the United States. 1963 marked the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln, and so the leaders represented major civil rights organizations. They were members of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, or SCLC, and others. They put aside their differences to come together for this march. That same year, violent confrontations broke out in the South. In Cambridge, Maryland, Pine Bluff, Arkansas, Goldsboro, North Carolina, Somerville, Tennessee, St. Augustine, Florida, and all across Mississippi, as our caller reminded us. In most cases, white people attacked nonviolent demonstrators seeking civil rights. And so this is why people wanted to march on Washington. But a lot disagreed on how the march would be conducted. Some wanted it to be a total shutdown of the city through civil disobedience. Others argued that the civil rights movement should remain nationwide in its scope, rather than focus its energies on the nation's capital and federal government. There was a widespread perception that the Kennedy administration had not lived up to its promises in the 1960 election, and Martin Luther King Jr. called Kennedy's race policy as tokenism. Note that, tokenism. That's a big thing with white liberals when you're dealing with white liberals a lot of times. On May 24th, 1963, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy invited the African-American novelist James Baldwin and a large group of cultural leaders to a meeting in New York City to discuss race relations. However, the meeting became antagonistic as black delegates felt that Kennedy did not have an adequate understanding of the race problem in this nation. Wow. It's important to remember that the Kennedys were not always on board with everything that Martin Luther King and a lot of the civil rights leaders were about. It's important to understand that they were sort of out of touch northern Massachusetts liberals in a lot of ways. That's why you have a lot of people who don't think you would have gotten the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act and all that stuff and the Civil Rights Act if Kennedy had not been assassinated. There is a large contingency of people who believe that really, his death made those things possible on some level. But this meeting did provoke the Kennedy administration to take action on civil rights. On June 11, 1963, President John F. Kennedy gave a notable civil rights address on national television and radio, announcing that he would begin to push for civil rights legislation. That night, the early morning of June 12, 1963, Mississippi activist Medgar Evers would be murdered in his own driveway, furthering escalating the national tension around the issue of racial inequality. Wow. We just talked about the anniversary of his death, the 60th anniversary of his death. I think it was last month when it came. I guess it was in June when it came. And we heard from his wife, Miss Myrtle Evers, who is still around, who's still with us. All right, folks, we are going to get to part 2 of the March on Washington 60th anniversary coverage later on in the show. But when we get back, happy Abbeys!